I was learning in the context of the dissertation and be able to share it with you guys. And really, I hope that we have a very good conversation about how best to interact with voters, but I also hope that you're able to take away things that are helpful for you in other realms of your life. I know that a lot of the things that I'll be talking about, I use as I think about my relationships with friends and with family and with coworkers. So I hope that maybe this will even end up being a little bit dual purpose for you. Stair, I can see that you are recording. I'm not seeing the screen yet with the slides. While she's doing that,
I'll be right up on that. I was
letting people
fiddling. I was fiddling, so let me get it up.
Sure. While she's pulling that up, I'll talk a little bit about, basically there are three things that I want to be covering. One is I want to just sort of to get the conversation going, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what it is that we are trying to do when we're talking with voters. And then we'll I'll give a bit of a presentation around what I'm calling brain basics for political communication. And then, perfect. And then towards the end, we will start to begin to apply some of these concepts to the work that we do. So as you can see, this is Your Brain on Politics. And Stair, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, it's a little political cartoon that I thought was sort of appropriate to this conversation. Yeah, there you go. Great. So I'll give you a second to take a look at that. And do please let us know, just if you're able to see. I think that everything should be pretty visible. But one of the reasons that I like this cartoon, it looks, is, and I think that it resonates with a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about. It's about polarization, and it's about feeling like we come from completely different planets in terms of how different our worldviews are. It's also about how in many ways, because of this context of polarization, we're already sort of programmed to sort of read each other in specific ways that don't necessarily have a lot to do with how with what the other person is actually saying. Stair, we're getting a comment from Vicky. Can we go full screen? I don't know if that will work for you.
I am trying to go full screen now. Also, everyone has the ability to make it larger or smaller on their own screen as well. So I will.
Okay, while Stair's working on that, I'll keep talking. And it's also, it's really about a lot of the snap judgments that we make. And obviously in our politicized context, this is something that we should be aware of. And so when you get a chance, Stair, if you could take us to the next one. Okay, so this is, I was saying what we'll cover is first we'll talk about what we're trying to talk to voters, just as a quick sort of grounding ourselves. Then we'll talk about what actually are brains on politics. And then finally, we'll talk about what are smart activist approaches. So for the next slide, if we may, what I want you to do, these are, what are we trying to talk to voters about? And let me just give a caveat. When I say talking to voters, I'm not actually referring to sort of the hardcore Trump types that sort of like the person in that cartoon. What I'm talking about are those persuadable voters that the campaigns that we're going to be working with, and in some cases are already working with, have identified as ones who are persuadable. And the reason that I think it's important to be talking in advance about these conversations is that, these may be for example, the coterie of suburban moms that we've been hearing about who have become very upset with the lack of attention to gun safety. So these may be people who we agree with on a few issues, but not many. And so we probably are going to be having conversations that are going to be a little bit more difficult because it's not going to be talking in an echo chamber, which is exactly why we're making these calls, because we want to be getting crucial votes by having some of these more difficult conversations. So again, we're talking to persuadable voters, and I would love, first of all, we're talking about having them register to vote or vote on election day. We're also asking them to vote for our candidate. What else? I see someone has added listen. Are there other things that we want to be doing when we're trying, and other things that we want to be talking to voters about? The entire slate, absolutely, yeah, not confining ourselves to any one particular candidate. I love this, planning when they'll vote, the make a plan, things they care about, what is important to them. Okay, these are wonderful. All of these are absolutely on target. Some other things, their vote matters, absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of these are really empowering messages, which is just wonderful, and it's going to be key to talking to these people. So I appreciate that. So we should learn about messaging points from voters. Yes, that's also another very important part of this. And what you're getting at is that it's a conversation. It's not one person talking at the person who's just answered the door or picked up the phone or is looking at their the text that's just arrived on their phone. So you're absolutely right. What about, let's also do the flip side of that question. And Esther, if you wouldn't mind the next slide. What do we not want to do with voters? And you can put that in the chat as well. Lecture them, argue, argue, have an argument. Okay, there's a good consensus out there. Put them on the defensive, and that's absolutely the key. That's the key word right there, is putting them on the defensive. Telling them who to vote for, put them down. Wonderful. Okay, this is all great, and so we're really grounded. Esther, if you wouldn't mind bringing us to the next slide. So here's the little screen about sort of an image of our brains on politics. Now that we've reminded ourselves of what we're trying to do when we talk with voters, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on inside our brains and bodies as we do so. And again, I keep referencing this hyperpolarized environment, but that's something that really came through strongly in my research, is exactly how we're primed by our environment to not listen to each other well and to not treat each other respect. And so all of the things that you all were just mentioning are absolutely critical to keep in the front of our minds. So Esther, if you wouldn't mind taking us to the next slide. There are two main messages that I think are particularly relevant to political communication and the stuff that we'll be doing with voters. First is that we think that we're rational, and that we're looking at the world logically and evaluating things. But in fact, really, it's only when we're feeling very safe and validated that we're able to have really rational thoughts. Otherwise, we're pretty emotional creatures. And we'll get a little bit into the neurobiology of that in a moment. The other thing also is that we're intensely social creatures. We're hardwired to be constantly analyzing how other people behave and what that means for us. In other words, we learn socially. We're thinking about, are we fitting in or not? Are we doing what other people are doing or not? And if we're not doing what the other people are around us, how much does it matter? What does it mean for us? And it also, this is another thing that's important to think about whenever we come into contact with a new situation or face a new idea. What do we know about how other people are reacting to that new situation or that new idea? Again, we learn socially. So if you wouldn't mind taking us to the next one. I'll start with that first one. We're not rational, and we'll talk a little bit about that neurobiology. Many of you probably know the work of Jonathan Haidt and his wonderful book, The Righteous Mind. He and a lot of other neuroscientists use this analogy of the elephant with his rider. And this is how he explains how non-rational we are. He says that our mind is like that tiny little rider perched on top of the elephant. And the rest of our unconscious being is that huge lumbering beast that just moves right along. So Esther, if you could take us to the next one. So leaving the analogy behind, neuroscientists speak of us having a dual processing system. This means that there are two sets of systems that are involved in our thinking. Our system one, which is here described as the limbic system, neuroscientists will describe this as a fast system or a hot system. It's intuitive and it's immediate. And as you can see, it's tied into the limbic system, which is about receiving input from our senses, and it's about emotions, engaging our emotions, which essentially is done because we need to make quick assessments about potential threats so that we stay alive. Then there's system 2, as you can see, the frontal lobe. It's the slow system. It's the cool system that processes information more slowly. And it's primarily located in the prefrontal cortex, which is where we process rational thought. And interestingly, the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. And it usually isn't fully developed until we're in our 20s, early 20s. And thinking back to some of the things that I did as a teenager, or watching some of the teenagers in my midst, I can see that, yeah. The logic part isn't completely developed yet. And the reason this two-tiered system exists is because our brain processing capacity is limited. There's just no way that we can take in and sort out and figure out the meaning of every single bit of information that comes into us through our senses. So, for example, think of all of the information that you are receiving right now. You can feel the clothes on your body and the amount of light that's in the room, perhaps smells coming up from the kitchen or the position your body is in, the other people on this call. It's almost infinite, all the information that your body is picking up about the outside world. And so your brain needs some quick way to figure out what information is important and what's not. So going back to the clothes analogy, you're wearing clothes, but your system 1 usually filters out and doesn't even raise to consciousness how your clothes are feeling on your body, unless, for example, it's a question of comfort and you realize you're not warm enough. And so system 1 does bring that into your consciousness so that you're able to put on a sweater or whatever. And more dramatically, system 1 is about noticing, amongst all the other smells that you're smelling, the first whiff of smoke that sets you on alert and starts your mind racing. Did I forget to turn off the stove? Did somebody drop a cigarette somewhere? So it's a survival system that kicks in. With system 1 designed to prioritize what information is worth your attention. And then system 2 kicks in to analyze the system a little bit more rationally. So for example, if our whole body has been put on alert after seeing a man with a gun, after a moment, we start to calm down just enough to engage our system 2 to be able to figure out, does that man have a gun because he wants to harm us, or is he in some capacity here to help us? So if we could go to the next slide. Another thing to know about the dual processing system is that when one system is being used, the other system largely shuts down. It's very hard for us to act rationally when we're in the grip of emotions. And it's also hard for us to experience sensory input when we're engaged in really deep rational thought. And I realized this, I had my own example of this one time when I was doing some research, and I was eating lunch while doing research, and I realized that by the time I got to the end of the paper that I had been reading, I hadn't tasted anything of my lunch because I had been so engaged in that system 2 that I simply was not able to access the information that was coming into me with system 1. I'm simplifying this a little bit. Neuroscientists increasingly are seeing this as a continuum, with only really extreme situations being where, for example, your rational capacity would shut down entirely. In most situations, it's a little bit, sort of along a continuum. You have more or less sensory 1 capability, more or less sensory 2 capability, depending on how threatening you're finding that situation. But in extreme cases, there is something called the amygdala hijack, and we probably all are familiar with this. This is when you perceive a threat that is so great that we're flooded with emotions that are relevant to a threat response, and we lose our ability to think rationally and creatively. And so this comes to what all of you were talking about in terms of, let's not argue with voters, let's listen to them, let's empower them with reminding them that their vote matters. Because in political conversations, this can come about when somebody says something that you think is a complete abrogation of something that you think is important. So it could be somebody says something that really contravenes your values or your beliefs, or even your dignity as a human being. And we'll get into the social aspects of threat in just a moment, but I do think that we all are able to remember a moment when we had an amygdala hijack in a political conversation. And so one of the things that it's good to do before entering into these is to sort of understand what your own triggers are, so that if and when on one of those conversations on the doorstep or on the phone, you have someone says something that triggers an amygdala hijack for you, you're more able to identify that that's what's happened and therefore gain control of the situation. So if we could go on to the next slide. The amygdala hijack is a really dramatic example of how system one triggers immediate reactions based on information. But there also are a lot of more subtle ones that involve how we process particularly social information. Again, back to the idea that the brain has limited processing capacity, we've sort of created mental shortcuts that help us to evaluate information. And we're often unaware that we've even constructed these mental models, such as, a little file for what to do when the doorbell rings, or what to do when you see a certain person on the street or something like that. And often we're completely unaware that we have these little mental models in our heads. And these are our biases, and sometimes they're also our prejudices. And we all have these because, again, it's just it's the system that our brains have developed to be able to prioritize amongst so much incoming information. So there are 3 of these that I think are particularly relevant to political conversation. Neuroscientists and psychologists have cataloged dozens and dozens, but the 3 that I think are important are these: confirmation bias, attribution error, and cognitive ease. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about this is because, again, learning how to spot them in our own thinking can help us switch from that emotional system 1 to a more thoughtful system 2, but it can also help us understand a little bit more the perspective of the person to whom we're talking. So if we could go to the next slide. Confirmation bias is a really important one, and I'm sure it's one that everyone is pretty familiar with. And it's our tendency to only listen to information that confirms our beliefs, and our tendency to ignore information that challenges our beliefs and that would make us have to change them. In a way, it's a little bit like a shield. We have these shields up in front of us, and if information is coming that doesn't fit with whatever is behind here, it just gets rejected and is bounced off. And what this does, particularly when we're going to be having these conversations with people that we don't agree with 100%, we're going to need to let down our confirmation bias and our sense that we really know how the world works. And we're going to have to be able to listen very carefully to what they're saying, because it's going to challenge our worldview. It's going to make us uncomfortable, but it's going to give us that chance to understand a little bit more of the way they're thinking, which could create an inroad for a better conversation, ideally leading to the choice of whom they'll be voting for. The middle one, fundamental attribution error. This is also pretty natural, and I find myself doing it rather a lot. It's when we tend to excuse our own bad behavior based on the context. But when somebody else does that very same thing, we tend to say it's a part of their personality. It's just the way they are. So, for example, I might say, I snapped at my husband last night because I was really tired. And then I might say, and then he snapped back at me because he always needs to have the last word. And so I'm giving myself a pass because I'm blaming it on the situation. But with him, I might be saying that's just the way he is, and there's nothing we can do about it. And one of the reasons this is important to be aware of in ourselves is because in a political context, it's what creates demonizing the other side. Already the other side, we're using that sort of language. It's that tendency where, again, we're giving our side passes and excuses for behavior, or maybe not even that. Maybe we're just seeing the complex situation that led them to do something. Whereas with someone from the other side, we're seeing it in black and white, and we're saying that it's because they're that way, and it's a sign of a negative sign of their personality. The third thing that I want to talk about in terms of a bias is cognitive ease, and it's very much related to confirmation bias. And it's the fact that Our brains are dealing with a lot, and they like to take the easy way out where they can get it. They like things that put less strain on them. So they like things that are simple and straightforward without a lot of complexity. And when you think about a lot of the changes in the way we talk to each other in this country, particularly with social media, with the character limitations on Twitter, things like that, those are all means of communication that are pretty simplified. And that's the reason, one of the reasons they've caught on is because our brains like that simplicity, all of us. But obviously, if we want to be having those complex, nuanced conversations with voters, we have to remind ourselves that we're probably not going to be feeling cognitively easy with whatever they're saying to us. We have to prepare ourselves in advance for the fact that we probably are going to be uncomfortable as we try and work through their logic and the way they see things. So I want to leave the "we're not rational" behind. And Sarah, if you wouldn't mind, I want to talk more about how we learn socially. Humans survive, as we know, by cooperating and pooling resources. And one of our most important resources, if not the most important resource, is knowledge. And so, as I was saying before, we watch each other so that we're able to imitate actions that would help us what we need to do. And it could be, how we obtain food, how we drive safely, even how we interact in society. So in other words, the way the phrase that a lot of psychologists use is serve and return. Someone hits the ball to us, we hit it back, they hit it back, we hit it back. And it's how we interact in a very fluid, dynamic, turn-taking sort of way. But it means that we are learning socially. We're building on the information that we get from other people. We're building on the behavior that we see from other people and their decisions and knowledge. And it also goes back to sort of that survival instinct of we're watching each other for the social knowledge of how well we think that we're being accepted and integrated into the group, because groups are a fundamental part of our evolutionary survival strategy. I want to go to the next slide. And this is, it's a sort of a mnemonic called SCARF. And I think about this a lot as I'm trying to unpack certain social situations. And this is sort of represents the social side of the amygdala hijack. This is no longer the person on the street we're trying to figure out if they're threatening or not. This is the situation that we're in, the social situation, the words that are being exchanged, and how threatening or not those are. Research has shown that there are certain social situations that trigger the same threat and reward circuits in our brain as those physical situations that we've been talking about. And David Rock is the one who put together the SCARF formulation. He's actually a management thought leader, but he interviewed hundreds, I think, of neuroscientists, and he sort of distilled what they had to say into the SCARF formula. And this is his representation of those social situations that actually trigger the same threat circuits as a physical danger. So these are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Let me just clarify that status here isn't sort of, do you have a high position or a less high position in a social hierarchy? It's more about, do you feel that your status as a human being is being accepted and validated? It's just status as a human being rather than necessarily social status. Interestingly, the two that people are most triggered by are questions of status and of fairness. So basically what he's saying is that when we actually feel threatened, when someone puts us down, again, this is to some of the things that you all were outlining, what we don't want to do to voters. So we feel threatened as a person when we are put down, or when we're not given the certainty that we need, when we're not given enough information about our situation, or when control is taken away from us, or we feel disconnected from others or treated unfairly. So those can create sort of those amygdala hijack moments, and we want to be aware of those. But the opposite is also true. We feel rewarded and therefore relaxed and more open-minded if we feel that our status as a human being is being affirmed, or if we're given some control and information around the situation, if we're feeling that we're in connection with someone rather than being rejected, and also obviously for being treated fairly. So I find a scarf is a great formula for activists to have, frankly, I think for all of us to have, because it helps us understand how to create a constructive situation in advance. It helps us also to do the flip and to avoid situations that can be perceived as social threats. And again, you all were naming a lot of those. And I just think that it's a wonderful way to think about how do you go about setting up a conversation with a voter that they're going to find rewarding, socially rewarding rather than threatening, so that they're relaxed and are able to engage with you in real ways. Another thing that I want to add here quickly is just another tough thing that we all have to deal with is the fact that we're actually hardwired to remember and to act more quickly on negative things rather than positive things. And evolutionarily speaking, that makes sense. It's more important for us to be able to react quickly to a bear coming at us than to admire a beautiful sunset or something. But obviously, it's yet another barrier to forming good relationships with people when our instincts are to start judging them and to protect ourselves. There actually have been a number of studies that show this in different settings. That we need to have many more positive encounters with someone to be able to outweigh any negative encounters. They've done it in management settings, how managers or staff their teams. A lot of them have been around couples. And I think that one of the first one, and the one that's most frequently referenced, is a 2004 University of Washington study that measured married couples' interactions and found that it takes 5 positive interactions to outweigh every 1 negative interaction to keep that couple together. And as I've said, a lot of studies have been conducted sort of testing this ratio in different settings, and that ratio is pretty consistent, 5 or 6. And so again, the way I think about that in terms of political conversation is one demeaning thing or one threatening thing can undermine an awful lot of the good that's been built up. So again, it's important to be very aware of this. And actually, that was one of the things that I found when I was doing my research around how liberals and conservatives perceive talking across the divide. One of the things that came out most strongly was conservatives feeling, when talking about Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment, and the emotion with which they spoke. It's clear that that one comment was just etched on their hearts because it was seen as I mean, it provoked a scarf sort of social situation threat. And one of my interviewees was describing how it's created this backlash, which, I mean, we're seeing it in many different ways, but as he was referring specifically to this backlash, he was talking about how it at that point had become very trendy amongst conservatives to wear an "I'm a deplorable" t-shirt and sort of brandish it, trying to reverse how much that those words had cut and hurt them. So let's move on to the last concept that I want to walk us through in terms of how we learn socially. There's actually 2 concepts: reciprocity and priming. And one of the things that I think is important to understand is that as human beings, we're also wired to reciprocate behavior. So putting it very simply, if you greet me with a smile, I'm very likely to return it unless something has happened to me such that I'm not going to. It's just normal instinctive behavior. If you smile, I'm going to smile back. The same holds true for more negative behaviors. If you say something aggressive to me or if you treat me unfairly, I'm probably going to do the same to you. And so obviously this is important for us, just reminding ourselves to start things off on a constructive foot with a smile and with a word choice. And there also has been some interesting research done around word choice and how people are primed by the words that they hear. There was one study a couple of years ago, I think, that looked specifically at word choice that opened up conversation with liberals and with conservatives. There are a number of studies out there. In fact, there's a whole wing of academic literature that characterizes political personalities by other personality types. So a degree of outgoingness, degree of open-mindedness, degree of desire for security, and a number of those things. And so these were some people who were sort of testing, they were going on the theory that, backed up by research, that liberals tend to be more open-minded than conservatives, which can create a problem if you're trying to get dialogue going between liberals and conservatives when one side is, I don't think that this touchy-feely stuff is worth my time. So what they found was that if you primed conservatives with the thought of how good the open marketplace of ideas was, they became more likely to be open-minded in conversations afterwards. So I use that not only as a specific example of word choice being able to hopefully unlock good conversations, but also just a reminder that we're so affected by the many different signals that we send each other that it's important to remember to keep the initial start of a conversation as constructive as possible. So what I want to do next is we'll shift into a little bit more of a conversational part. So if you wouldn't mind taking us to the next slide, Stair. I've got 3 questions here, and these are questions that we can pose to ourselves as we ask ourselves, what of all of what I've been talking about is relevant for talking to voters? And one of the questions is sort of self-focused. What triggers an amygdala hijack in you that could be bad when you're talking to voters, and how can you sort of think through in advance how you could control it? Another question is even more broad, that is, how can you use knowledge of SCARF to make voters feel validated and therefore have a better conversation with them? And then a third question is, how can you use reciprocity to start an interaction with a voter constructively? And what I wanted to do was have people sort of take a moment or two to think about that. And then we can have, if people want to share, they can either share their answers in the chat box, or they can, we can unmute them and they can sort of explain their answer. And in this way, we start to do a little bit of crowdsourcing of what all of this information, how all of that information can help us be better on those crucial upcoming phone calls and texting and letter writing. So just take a minute or two, pick one question that you're most interested in answering for yourself, and then share it with us. Okay, I see that Susan Kuhn is asking for another run through of SCARF and examples of each of those 5 states. Great question. And again, as I said, I use this tool to decipher situations all the time. So the first is status, which is your status as a human being. So if you are, if somebody puts you down or says something negative or insults you in some way, then you're going to be, that can often trigger the sense of a social threat for you in a very big way. The opposite of that, though, would be if you feel like somebody is really there and listening closely to you, and you know that they respect you as a human being, even if, even in a sort of a cross-divide conversation when you know that they may not agree with you, but they still respect you for being a person who has come up with her own ideas through a legitimate process. So that is status. Certainty. Certainty is about our need for having information, because that helps us to understand and evaluate and gives us more options for how we're able to, or for making decisions about what actions to take. So one of the things that I've noticed with the start of COVID is the companies, particularly in early days when there was so much uncertainty, the companies that did better and seemed to have employees who felt more secure and more valued and more able to do their work were the companies that were giving a lot of information about what the status of the company was, what the finances were, what their thoughts were around what would happen. And so certainty is about how we really do, we're hardwired to need information to be able to make decisions on. Another one is autonomy. Autonomy is closely related to certainty. Autonomy is just wanting to have control. We all want to have some measure of control over our lives. And if you do something to take away someone's control, if you tell them, it's not important that you know that, I'm not gonna, that decision is for me to make, not for you, then you're undermining their sense of autonomy, which is another social threat that they'll perceive. Relatedness is about the connection that we feel with each other. And there have been a number of articles coming out recently. I think that one in the New York Times a couple of days ago was saying that some researchers are coming to the conclusion that isolation and loneliness is as much of a threat to a human being as obesity. That is sort of another aspect of relatedness and how deeply threatened we can feel socially if we don't feel that we're in connection with other people around us. And so again, if you're trying to create a constructive situation, you want that person to feel not neglected or isolated, because again, thinking about living together and surviving in groups, we need to know that we're part of the group. And so that's another thing, is that you want to make sure that the other person is part of the group. And fairness. Fairness is fairness. I think that's a pretty self-explanatory one. But that, again, what the research has found is that questions of status, like, do I feel like that person is valuing me as a human being? And questions of fairness, those are the two that are felt sort of most acutely in terms of a social threat situation. So I hope that helped. So I see someone is saying that triggers for me are when someone insults me or when someone starts attacking abortion rights. And again, that's great to know, because both of those things could happen in one of these conversations. And so you may want to think then, if that happens, what is a good way to either get out of the conversation or see if you can turn it around. Generalizations such as all immigrants are criminals and freeloaders. Yeah. This, I think, relates to a lot of liberal sense of fairness, and that's an unfair characterization, and a lot of liberals feel that way. That was another interesting thing that I was seeing in the dynamics of my research, is that both liberals and conservatives, to a person, felt that it would be very difficult, if not worth the time, to have a conversation across the divide. Liberals, and as they spoke about why they didn't trust the other side, a lot of liberals would say, because a lot of them make really racist remarks, whereas conservatives would say something like, I don't get why they're dropping the friendship over just something as unimportant as politics. And again, I just thought that those were sort of very interesting worldviews. But like you, I tend to fall into that liberal categorization. Catherine is saying, yes, the masks, wearing masks are so politicized. Wearing the mask as an affront to her freedom versus it's a way to protect others. And how you breach that divide. I don't think that it's easy at all. And again, I think that one of the questions that I have found most helpful when I do try and have conversations across the divide, and I want to say they're really hard in a lot of cases, but I also have usually found them to be worthwhile, is to ask somebody, again, in an affirming way, I'm really interested in what you said, and I would like to hear what experiences you've had that have led you to think that. Because, and again, you have to do it in a genuine way. If you don't really want to hear what their experiences are, then don't ask the question. But Catherine, if it's a friend, I'm sure that you're wanting to do that. And that question of what makes you, I'm truly interested in hearing what led you to that conclusion. What you're doing is you're affirming their status. You're saying, yeah, we're both trying to figure this out. We're both the same in this conundrum. And I want to hear, I value your opinion, even if I may not agree with it, I value it and I want to hear it. And it's going to be little sort of baby steps like that. Again, rebuilding trust and understanding the complexities of their thought. Often we don't even understand the complexities of our own thought. Or the reverse can be, we don't understand uncomplex our own thinking is until somebody pushes and says, well, why do you think that? And suddenly you realize that you've got like 2 answers and no more. So I hope that helps. I try to do it and it's really hard, but that seems to be one of the best questions to unlock things. Just another question that I have found, actually, and the research bears this out. A couple of years ago, 2 researchers were working with an LGBTQ group who was doing door-to-door canvassing on, I forget what the exact measure was, but it was something in support of gay rights. And they found that when the canvassers said to the person on their doorstep, can you tell me a time when you felt marginalized? And truly listened, asked more questions, and got that other person to talk about how they had felt when they were marginalized, that was one of the things that not only helped to change their attitude in the moment, but when they went back and asked people 3 months later, that particular question of, it's called mentalizing, thinking about the other person's thinking and getting them to think about their thinking, is that can really create some internal reflection that can create changes that can be lasting attitude changes. We've got, yes. The point of saying that you're voting against your own interests. People don't like this. Again, it sounds, it kind of goes back to like the conservative reaction to the deplorables comment of that is so patronizing, and how dare you tell me what my interests are, even if we perceive it that way. That's going to be, oh, thank you, John. Yes. That's going to be the way those sorts of comments are going to be perceived. Okay, we're saying yes, please raise hands in order to ask questions. That can be done if you don't know how to raise your hand. They're talking about electronically raising your hand, which you can do if you go to the bottom of your screen and you press reactions. Usually there should be a way. Is that the way to do it on Zoom? Or am I giving out incorrect instructions? No, forgive me. It's you go to participants. If you click on the participants link, it will give you a list of all the participants and 3 commands at the bottom: invite, mute me, and raise hand. So if you press raise hand, I'm not seeing any questions.
I see Barbara Favola. Senator Barbara Favola, our honored guest tonight, has raised her hand, and I am going to unmute her. If I can get my mouse to cooperate over here. Running it around here a little bit.
Hello. I'm so excited Senator Favola is with us.
Yeah, this is marvelous.
Yeah, give me a second. I can't. Here we go. Here we go. Almost there. Almost there. Unmute. Unmute. Come on. We had a couple.
Come on.
There we go.
You did it.
There we
You
go.
did it.
Yay.
You're amazing,
All right.
Sarah. Thank you.
Let's
Marissa, this is a great presentation, and I always want to keep refreshing what I've learned in the past, and I always pick up a new point or two, and you've been good at that. I was just going to say, and I don't know where this would fit on your scarf ladder, but when I'm connecting or attempting to connect with a constituent who may be way out of my comfort zone, not a progressive at all, probably, maybe moderate, but very conservative, possibly to the far right. And I have to admit, I don't talk to too many constituents in that realm. But when I do, I listen, as you suggested, but I frequently say, and it has worked for me, and I don't know what you would call this, but I frequently say, you seem like a thoughtful individual and a reasonable person, and I can understand, how you came to your policy conclusion, but it just really does bother me that President Trump generalizes in a very negative way, groups of people that he deliberately wants to demonize, like, all immigrants are racist. We have to close the borders because they absolutely are all bad. And usually the person will say, yeah, I don't agree with that either. So I sort of take that as the common ground, because most people, even though they support Trump, really don't agree with his style, if you will. And so I try to use that as the entree to maybe maneuvering, possibly to a middle ground. I don't know if you have any comments on that, or if that's a helpful remark.
No, I think that's very helpful. And there are many things that that formulation does. First of all, you're saying you're a thoughtful person, and I can agree with, I can understand ways in which you came to that position. So that right there, you're validating them. And so you're hitting the S part of SCARF. I also like the way you're turning into a little bit more of a conversation too. You're inviting them to come in, because once you're able to find that one connection of common ground, it goes back to the priming concept of then because we're connected, this is serve and return, we're going to be looking for more ways to agree. So I think that's a wonderful way of handling it.
Okay. It has worked in the past. So you must be right.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Other hands raised or comments or questions?
I have another comment.
Please.
It's a little political, so forgive me, but do you?
All about politics.
You don't have to respond if you don't want to, Melinda, but is there a particular candidate out there, potential VP candidate, who might embrace naturally some of the characteristics that you think are necessary to reaching across or at least reaching to that middle, to that undecided middle, who are actually going to decide our presidential election in 7 states? I mean, it'll end up being the Electoral College math, and we'll have to win these independents.
No, I agree. I think that's a great question. I think for me, it comes down to that sort of conversational style. And I have to admit, I don't think that I've seen enough of them in that sort of situation where, it's mostly, I've mostly seen them in primary settings where they're giving certain defined messages to the other people. So, but that is going to be something that I'm going to be keeping my eye out for from now on. So thank you.
No problem.
Barbara, you asked a big question, just so you know. I loved it.
Oh,
Yes. But I think your point is well taken, that it really is important how we talk and how we message. So I think what you've said is, really that we are focused on that, because you need to be able to, as a candidate, or even like in this conversation with Melinda today, how we speak to each other is really important. So I love that you went right to it though.
Mm-hmm.
It's Catherine here. I know you're looking for me, but
that's what politicians try it. That's what I try to do, get right to it so we can come up with a solution.
Susan Harford has her hand up.
Oh, of course. Let's unmute.
Stare, are you able to unmute her? There
we go.
Yes, thank you. So what are words or phrases, or where does this fit in SCARF, a way for us to not just even discuss, but find unity? Because we have big things right now with this pandemic, and things that we really, a really great leader could unify us on.
To be honest, I don't know how much that a great leader would be able to unify all of us. That's my own personal opinion. But I think that an even marginally better leader would be able to unify more of us. I think, again, it goes back to it, and Barbara, perhaps this is part of the answer to your, as Catherine pointed out, very good question, is it's about that validation, and it's about knowing that the person who is leading us really understands and appreciates every single one of us, is the president for all of us, not just for the people who voted for him or her. And so I think that first and foremost, being able to let people know that you are truly hearing them, it's not just a ploy, that's absolutely key. And so, how that comes across for us on the, on the more sort of individual level as we're talking to voters, is that needs to be our attitude first and foremost, is going out demonstrating that we truly are seeing this as an equal citizen to equal citizen moment, and we want to have that conversation. And then
can I add to that? I mean, are there words like, a shared, the word sharing, shared status, and a shared mission to be patriotic, that being patriotic is all of us.
absolutely, and that
Country.
yeah, and that gets back to the priming sort of methodology or approach. There have been a number of people who have started to apply this to the field of negotiation, and the advice that they give is exactly what you're saying, which is, in your opening statements, make these statements that are sort of assumptions that we will be able to find something that we can agree on. So you're setting expectations, you're creating some forward movement around what your goals are. And if your goals are, some form of unity, that can be one thing. Another thing, this sort of goes back to the, finding a small win to build on together, is sometimes when you're in a conversation, when you're talking across a divide like that, maybe the only thing that initially you can agree on is that polarization and not being able to talk to each other is not a desirable thing. And sometimes even just starting with that acknowledgement, hey, we both think that this stinks, that we're not able to have good conversations with each other. That can be a conversation opener because you both are nodding your heads. And so I think that probably, that gets to your point as well, is just talking about the fact that we're tearing ourselves apart and nobody really wants that. I admit I sometimes wonder.
We have another hand raised here from Liz Walker. I'm trying to unmute her. She's not cooperating. There we go.
Hi there. There are two perspectives or points of view that when they approach me on it, I really am sort of stumped on how to apply SCARF in a positive way. And the two issues are when they say to me, I cannot vote for the Democrat, whoever that might be, because of their position on abortion. And the second one, the conversation that I have a problem with getting beyond, is when somebody has very strong, conservative, fundamental religious values, and then they're so supportive of President Trump. And they seem to negate all of his values, and yet they feel that he reflects who they are in their value system. I can't figure out how to get beyond those two items.
Yeah.
To have a constructive conversation.
I hear you, and to be honest, having studied this and tried to engage in it for a long time, sometimes it's just not going to happen. And that's part of understanding. Part of it, I think, is choosing when and how to have these conversations when we think that there will be a good payoff. And then the other thing is just knowing your own triggers, keep taking those deep breaths and just keep asking really good follow-up questions. And I sometimes sort of think of it as I put on an anthropologist hat and I pretend like I've got no stake in this game. I'm just really interested in how this person who lives in the same country that I do has managed to arrive at a worldview that is so completely different from mine. And so sort of, again, trying to detach myself from the emotions and my own emotional reaction, and just sort of consider it sort of a bit of an intellectual puzzle, but one that I care about. I care about the other person. And I think that it's sort of a combination of recognizing that it is really, this is not easy stuff that we're doing, which is why we need to talk about this. And, you know, I think for all of us, a lot of this is repetition, but it's difficult stuff. So it's good to go through it again and with other people. So I think that it's both a recognition of this is going to be, to truly create change, often this can be a long conversation or series of conversations. It's not going to be a silver bullet sort of one-off thing. And then also recognizing that sometimes it's just not going to happen. And figuring out, would I be engaging in this conversation because I just want to make a point? I want to express myself in my anger? Or, you know, is there going to be a chance? Unfortunately, this stuff is hard. This stuff is hard.
Mindy?
Mm-hmm.
It's Catherine here. I have a kind of a interesting way to look at this, and because I was listening to a great podcast on Slate yesterday about we really have to understand the society we live in, right? When we're also talking, and they are talking about it's held up by patriarchy, white supremacy, you know, the white supremacist issue, capitalism, and anti-Black racism. And they're like, if you don't understand that everybody's within that system. So with the comment with the religious person that the other person Liz was having trouble with, I understand that, because it's like, you have to understand you're operating in a power structure and system that's this like ingrained in how we operate. So when you have to really get into that, it's really kind of deep to understand that. You know, that you can't, this is a conversation, yes, and we listen, but we are really entrenched in this system that made America, white supremacism, racism. And so this is big stuff. So to really kind of look at the power structures, I'm interested in, do you use those power structures that are actually huge and how we actually interact, or what we have at stake? You know, if we're religious, what we're really talking about, what patriarchy means to us, what God, the Father, being the main head of the whole family, when we're talking about letting Trump be the big daddy and we just go along with it. I mean, I think it's good if we understand it, because then we don't get so, you know, just overwhelmed by the person we're speaking to. They're really entrenched in this belief system. It's for the anthropologist.
Exactly. Yeah, I was about to
Or
say.
what are you thinking?
I agree that that's important. And I think that it's a great thing for us to use ourselves as we're, you know, again, putting on our anthropologist hat to try and take a more intellectual rather than emotional approach to all of this. Questions of power structure those are big things. We are still coming to understand them, even those of us who see them that way and want to understand them, and springing those sorts of conversations on people who don't want to see that.
No, I'm not talking about actually confronting them with patriarchy.
Okay.
I mean, as a person listening, when I go to the door, and like the other Liz, I'm listening to a voter that we're starting to align about the whole abortion thing. But when we get, you know, that he believes that he doesn't want women to die, and we get down to the fact that really biblically there are just dirty, slutty women, you know? And so it's like, what I mean is that we have to understand that there is a place this comes from. It's not, we may never align, but we have to, if we don't understand it, you know, when we're speaking to someone, is all I'm saying, not to bring it up as a conversation, heck no. Just in our structuring when we are talking, I think people need to understand those bigger concepts, because then you could actually get into the way we talk. We don't want to trigger those also concepts when we're talking to that person. If we couch it the wrong way, we can trigger those responses of fear, or the fear of the immigrant. But if we say, you know, Danny down the street, you like Danny, he cuts your lawn. Well, his mom is from this country. I mean, and she came over here, and he loves Danny. So you realize you need to talk about the person, Danny, as an immigrant, but you have to also understand how that's used in this systemic way of the fear of the immigrant that's involved in all this racism kind of stuff, is what I mean.
Sure. No, that's a great point to make. Yeah. I see that Barbara has her hand up.
I just wanted to comment. Thank you, Catherine, for bringing up that context. when I get into conversations and they're clearly bringing up issues that I would not agree with, or I don't agree with the way they assess the issues, I don't agree with how the constituent might come down on the issue, I try to go to the concepts of fairness and justice, because I have found that those two concepts really do have a lot of broad-based support. Now, people think about them differently, or they've got a biased lens, and that's to Catherine's point. You're absolutely right. But you can usually get them to say, and then you can bring up a personal example. You know, you really don't want to see a person, just because the person's black, die because he's jogging. That's really not right. And person could be a deep racist, but 9 out of 10 times they'll say, yeah, you're right. Nobody should die just because they're jogging. And then all of a sudden there's sort of this light that goes off, and at least they don't think I'm an ogre. And I have heard them, but I gave an example that sort of forced them to cross the bridge a little bit, and then we can conclude our conversation and leave. But I do think those two concepts of fairness and justice sort of can open the door for a common conversation. Just my 2 cents.
Super. No, that's more than 2 cents. That's great. Thank you.
3 cents. Thanks.
Oh, wonderful.
I like being with folks who, you know, just really know the value of things.
Other people would call the $64,000 question, so you may have underchanged yourself. But
Right.
Looks like Susan has another question.
Once again, it seems, okay, here we go.
Yes.
Susan.
It has just hit me in this dialogue how important what we're doing is. It's really important. I mean, you think about the civil rights movement, and think about how much of that movement happened in conversations. I mean, this is big stuff.
Yeah.
And you're giving us a kind of, it isn't just a tool to get out the vote. You're really giving us the human, and I mean that in the fullest possible sense, what happens humanly in that exchange. Barbara, the woman or man you're referring to is never going to think the same again.
No, right, yeah, hopefully.
No, they're not. They're not. I mean, I grew up with a very racist father, and I had that kind of, occasionally would be lucky enough to, you know, hit it right with that kind of an experience. And people change.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
and hopefully they don't say, oh, well, this person's an exception. I mean, there's always a way it can go south, and I shouldn't say south, excuse me. There's always a way it cannot work the way we want it to work, but it's just the power in our hands in having these conversations. This is a social movement. This isn't just an election. This is lasting change.
Oh, God.
Really changing how people are.
I hope so. I hope so.
I mean, that's the power. It's not a guarantee, but that's, you know, I'm really happy this session is in the, you know, the spectrum that Stair and Catherine and all have put together. It's just really means a lot.
It's the power of crowdsourcing. All of this wisdom is fantastic. So maybe that's a good note to end it on.
That's a great note. Great note.
We had a couple more slides. Should I go ahead and show
Not
those?
Oh no, they were takeaway slides. The only other thing is,
Okay.
I will make one last pitch. I run Winning Wednesdays, which are get out the vote opportunities every second and fourth Wednesday of the month out of the Women's National Democratic Club. And this is where virtually we're organizing phone banks and text banks and letter writing and whatnot. So if any of you guys are interested in joining us and trying out these skills and teaching others, because we do try and create a sense of solidarity, we're all sort of trading strategies. You're welcome to join us. And you can just Google Women's National Democratic Club and you'll find it. But thank you all.
I just want to say thank you to our Nova Network and our awesome women leaders who are always there. You know, Stair, you're great. Catherine, you're great. So many of you have really stepped up and helped all of us create a stronger community and to affect change. And it's just been remarkable. I was so proud of what we did in Virginia in the 2019 elections. And I think the last General Assembly session showed that. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Favola, for coming tonight. We so appreciate it. For everybody on this call, I put in the chat the link to the Winning Wednesdays. Oh, don't spotlight me. I have my nighttime glasses on. But I put Melinda's chat to the Women's National Democratic Club. And I'll let Melinda, thank you so much. And remember that Melinda and another team of really great, smart people talking about media and disinformation will be at the Women's Summit. And they'll be featured. We have a great panel because it's how we talk, how we communicate, and obviously this battle against disinformation will be at the Women's Summit. So Melinda, thank you for being here, and I can't wait for you to come back again. And I'll let Stair just close it all out, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Senator Favola. Thank you, Mindy. Was really informative and lots to continue to think about and to take deep breaths and get calm and scarf.
Words to live by.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and
Bye, everybody, for coming tonight.
We'll see you next week. We're doing so many things, so I hope to see you again soon.
Oh, yeah. One more pitch. Yes, we're doing things all the time for our pre-summit programming. So women, go to networknova.org. We have tons of great pre-programming coming up. So thank you. Thank you, friend Stair. Love you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 Well, don't go. Is Melinda staying? Stair, are you still here? Okay, she's gone.
She's gone.
That was really good. So that was so interesting. Thank you, John. Bye, Jane. Bye, Jackie. Eileen, Alex. Hey, Jane. There she is. Unmute yourself.
I might have made it so that she couldn't. So now she
is now. I got to take the salad out of my tooth. Okay. You can stop recording too.
Oh, yeah.